Today, I found the all-new MrBeast Lab Swarms Atomic series super early, and I'm gonna open this entire box of 12 test tubes to see all the new swarms we can find. So without further ado, let's grab our first test tube. Here's the all-new MrBeast Lab Swarms Atomic series test tubes I found. I'm not sure when these officially release or if they're out worldwide yet, but I found them today and let's open them up. Alrighty, first thing I noticed, the test tube's orange this time. But let's look at the little pamphlet and see if there are any new swarms to find. Looks like they're all new. I'll try and put up some pictures of all these new characters. But let's grab our test tube and open them up and see who we can find. It looks like in the Atomic series, instead of the Hyperchrome Panther, we'll be looking for the limited edition silver mystery case. Once again, there's only 1,000 made, so let's add water to our test tube and see if we can find it. Now that I added water to the test tube, let's give it a good mix. That should be good enough, so now let's release the slime. It looks like it's orange this time, which is very cool. Now I'll go clean them off and see who we got. Our very first Atomic series test tube, we found Contaminatoad, who's a translucent common, and the Mutant Panther, who's an ultra rare glow-in-the-dark MrBeast Squad metallic. So very good for our first test tube, but let's move on to our second one. Let's mix up our second test tube. Now let's release the slime and see who we got. Now let's clean them up. In our second test tube, we got Army Ant, who's a common, and Mutant Mole, who's another common. So let's grab our third test tube and add water. Now let's release the orange slime. Now let's see who we got. Our third test tube, we got Nitroscope, who's a common, and the Robo Panther, who's a metallic, glow-in-the-dark, ultra-rare MrBeast Squad, and kinda looks like Thanos. Let's add water to our fourth test tube and see who we get. Now let's mix it up. Now let's release the orange slime. In this test tube, we found the Hazardous Handset, who's a common, and the Hazbat, who's another common. Now let's move on to our fifth test tube. Now let's release the orange sludge. Now I'll clean them off and see who we got. In this test tube, we got Dungflinger, who's a common, and Stealth Sloth, who's a translucent common. Now let's release the Atomic Slime. In this test tube, we got Robo Raccoon, who's a common, and Shuttershock, who's another common. Now let's move on to our next test tube. Now let's release the slime. In this test tube, we got Manic Mailbox, who's a metallic, rare MrBeast Squad, and the Atomic Panther, who's a metallic, glow-in-the-dark, ultra-rare MrBeast Squad. And he's one of my new favorites, I think. Now let's add water to our next test tube and see who we get. Now let's release the orange sludge. In this test tube, we got Neon Waste, who's a translucent, metallic, rare MrBeast Squad, and the Contaminated Cactus, who's a translucent, metallic, rare MrBeast Squad, and I love the colors on him. Let's add water to our next test tube. Now let's mix it up. Now let's release the slime. Now we'll clean them off and see who we got. In this test tube, we got Atomic Toilet, who's a common, and the Mad Mantis, who's another common. Now let's move on to our next test tube. Now let's release the slime. In this test tube, we got the Steel Jaw Iguana, who's a translucent metallic rare MrBeast squad, and the Robo Panther, who's a metallic glow-in-the-dark ultra rare MrBeast squad. Before we add water to our last test tube, if you'd like to see me open the 12th one, I'll have a YouTube short posted tomorrow opening this one. Now let's open this one up and see who we get. Now let's release the slime. In our last test tube, we got Attack Tube, who's a common, and Pest Tube, who's a metallic, translucent, rare MrBeast squad. And I like both of these quite a lot. Here are all the new swarms we found in the all-new MrBeast Lab Swarms Atomic series. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll be back tomorrow with more MrBeast Lab Swarms unboxings.